The Real Work on the Mystery of Mastery. That's the latest from New York Times bestselling author Adam Gopnik. Welcome to Techstination, Adam. Thanks for spending time with us.
Wonderful to be with you, Fred.
Well, Adam, so many of us know you from your writings for The New Yorker, and your interests are so varied. Art, food, music, sports, politics. I don't know if there's anything you don't touch on. Tell us about the motivation for and the purpose of this book on mastery.
Well, this book kind of happened to me sideways, as most good things happen in life. My then 13-year-old son, Luke, got fascinated, as 13-year-old boys will, with card magic. And he went off with his wonderful teacher, the sleight of hand man, Jamie and Swiss, to Las Vegas. And so I dutifully followed him. And while I was in Las Vegas witnessing what magicians do, I heard this phrase, the real work. And it's a term magicians use to mean someone who's got maximum technical proficiency, but still has a kind of wise, empathetic engagement with his audience's expectations. And so the real work arrived at me, hit me as a great subject. And by chance, I happened to be studying life drawing, old-fashioned classical drawing, at the same time as a kind of act of compensation for 40 years as an art critic without being able to draw. And those two things colliding, this idea of the real work and my own pursuit of, I won't say mastery, but of minimal mastery, of understanding the mystery of mastery, led me to the book.
Well, you take us on your personal journey here in trying a variety of new skills. Tell us more about that. Maybe what you learned and learned about yourself.
Absolutely. Well, starting with drawing, just in the natural course of things, this all happened organically over the course of a decade. I studied dancing. I studied boxing, which I'm still engaged in. I learned how to drive, which came very late in my life. And I learned how to bake with my mother. And I got two things particularly from it, Fred, that I think are broadly applicable. First is that everything we learn follows the same pattern, remarkably so. We begin by learning small, stumbling, very often counterintuitive steps, not the things you would naturally think would be what you would want to master something. When you're learning boxing, you don't learn to unleash your belligerence. You learn a set of defensive gestures that you have to very counterintuitively return to at every moment. But those small stumbling steps, as in dancing, you start off the most awkward person on the floor. If you persevere in them, however stupidly, with however little talent, if you persevere in them, at one point they will magically become that thing we call the flow. They will become a seamless sequence, or a seemingly seamless sequence, which gives you that incredible cognitive opiate of absorption in a thing outside yourself. And that's true across this whole range of experiences. And the good news about that is that it's available to us, even if we never become expert at the expertise we're pursuing. The other thing I learned, which was personal, is that we are everything we are in everything we do. And I mean by that when we're trying to master a new thing, we never do it in isolation. We never do it in isolation. We always do it in the broader context of our lives. I was learning baking from my mother, and everything I learned about baking was a conversation with my mother. Learning to drive, I had my father physically installed inside me because he's a wonderful driver and I had put it off. And that was essential to the experience. So we bring our entire lives with us as we try to master new things.
You know, when I've talked to my kids over the years and now grandchildren, I tend to use the word passion a lot and with them. That doesn't always equate, I guess, with mastery, but maybe it has a little something to do with it.
Yes, it has everything to do with it, I would say. It has to do with it, exactly, that without that admixture of passion, of human desire, everything becomes totally sterile. It's not just, excuse me, that we need passion to pursue things. It's that what we find is that by inserting a certain kind of willful imperfection into the things we do, that's what makes them intriguing to other people. None of us are particularly interested in a singer or a pianist who does everything mechanically perfectly, but has no idiosyncratic individual style to add to it. The singers and the musicians we love all are instantly recognizable as themselves. And it's because their passion is passed through, if you like, through the prism of their personalities into the work that they do. And that, I think, is the secret, if you like, of genuine mastery.
Yeah, you talked about learning to draw as an art critic, including in the book with a nude model, which must have
Yes.
been interesting. Do you think this is something you can tell us about that? But is this something more critics should be doing, actually trying to do what it is that they critique?
Well, what I think is that, you don't have to be able to hit a 100-mile-per-hour fastball to be a sports writer. If you did, there'd be no sports writers. And the same way, you don't have to be able to draw particularly well to be an intelligent and sensitive, responsive art critic. But I think that if you don't have some sort of deep physical understanding of the activity you're observing, if you don't know what it's like to swing and miss at a 50-mile-per-hour fastball, you'll never fully understand the challenges that are presented to the people you're studying. Artists don't exist in big abstractions, though art critics often impose big abstractions on them. Artists are fascinated, obsessed with the difference between the way the right leg rests on the ground and the way the left leg is lifted from the ground. And the more you become sensitive and aware of that kind of minute distinction, the more deeply I think you engage with art, just as the way you become more minutely aware of the difference between a screwball and a fastball and a forkball, the better you understand the game of baseball.
You talk about the process in achieving a degree of mastery being, I guess, painful. You really take us into the world of magic here, and you mentioned that already. And magicians, for instance, really became absorbed in that, didn't you?
Yes, well, magicians fascinate me because they have as much technical proficiency as any artists or technicians you will ever meet. What they have to be able to do with their hands invisibly is astounding, and they work harder than almost any artists I know. But their technique, as my friend Jamie Swiss says, has to be invisible, not just transparent. And so it's fascinating as a civilian to kind of get them to open up about the nature of their art form, because it's a model, Fred, it's a template for everything else that we do. The way that a magician has to master the technical side of card manipulation, but also understands that you don't do magic with your fingers. You really do it with your mind. You do it by thinking, what does Fred expect to happen next? And let me be sure that I do something other than what Fred expects to happen next. That's an act of active empathy, of mind reading, if you like, that's fundamental to magic. And I think that's true about everything else we do. If I'm writing an essay, I want Fred, right, not to look at the first sentence and say, oh, I know exactly where this is going. I want it to take left turns into traffic. I want it to take surprising directions. I want it to be humanly unpredictable. And so what magicians learn to do in this very peculiar, specific art form, I think, is broadly instructive for all the rest of us.
And we all have this fascination, I think most of us do anyway, with magicians and are astounded, whether it's the primetime specials from David Copperfield to the America's Got Talent card tricks and things. It's so fascinating for all of us, and we don't really know the work that goes into it, do we?
Yes, exactly. And I was blessed because my son Luke was a little bit of a 13-year-old prodigy, and the whole world of magic opened up to him, and therefore to me. He worked as David Blaine's personal assistant
Wow.
for a while. And that gave me what I think is the best story in the book. David Blaine was doing the bullet catch for a television special, and he was doing it the old-fashioned way, which means with a real rifle and a real bullet. It's where you fire a bullet into a steel cup that's in the magician's mouth. And I said to Luke, I said, well, what's the trick? And he said, it's a real bullet and it's a real powerful steel cup and all of that. And I said, so there's no trick to the bullet catch? And he said to me, no, Dad, there is a trick to the bullet catch. The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. And I thought that was a kind of a Zen koan that's true across so many fields. We all know that the trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. We all know, and whatever the thing is, that we've attempted to get good at some moment, you have to put all your preparation, all your technique, all of your mastery aside and just step up and catch the bullet, whether I'm delivering a speech or you're delivering a demo, whatever it is. That moment of catching the bullet, that moment of existential exposure is what we all have to struggle with in our pursuit of mastery.
Is there anything that defines mastery? I mean, we may think, wow, I did that just the way I wanted to, or but maybe to someone else's eyes, no, he's not even close to mastery. Tell me what your thoughts are.
Two things I think are true. One is that the people we revere as the greatest masters of their profession, vocation, art form, always have a particular idiosyncratic individual style. I was off in the Bob Dylan Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, not long ago. And there's a beautiful letter by Dylan in which he says, in effect, I know I don't sing very well, but I breathe really well. And it's true, if we think about Bob Dylan singing, it's an act of original breathing as much as it is hitting notes. So that's true about the great masters. For the rest of us, and this I think is one of the most important takeaways in the book, is that we can get as much pleasure from doing things poorly inside ourselves as we can from doing things well, so long as we submit ourselves to the process, so long as we persevere with absolute passion, to use your word, in learning it. I will never, Fred, be a good boxer. You will not want to put me in the ring with anyone except another short Jewish intellectual who's pursued a sedentary occupation for 40 years. But I love boxing because just the moment when the sequence of blows that you're taught, this choreography of fists and of punches that you're taught, suddenly is something you stop thinking about and you just are pouring out in a sequence. That's such a high in itself, such an opening onto the flow, that it's every bit as satisfying and as heart-lifting for you as it would be if you were actually in the middle of a ring doing it at the highest possible level. I call that the hummingbird effect because, you know, the old story, which is true, that hummingbirds and elephants expend the same number of heartbeats in a lifetime, 1 billion heartbeats over 100 days for the hummingbird, over 100 years for the elephant. And we all have little hummingbirds inside ourselves that are content with the way our heartbeats beat and get meaning out of that, our interior heartbeats, and don't have to judge them by the exterior world of the elephant.
I wonder where I am in the count now towards that billion. So we're often told how important it may be to keep learning new things as we age. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, you mentioned you learned to drive on the later side.
Yeah, I was in my 50s before I learned to drive. I learned to drive on the same day. I got my driver's license on the same day as my 20-year-old son. I doubt that has happened very often. I think in the simplest way, you never come to an end of the pleasure of learning how to do new things. And I don't mean that just in a kind of hobbyist way. It's not something to fill up your time. Just the opposite. It it elongates your time for the reason I was talking about a moment ago. That incredible high that we can get, what I call a cognitive opiate. You know, there's drugs we put in our veins, but there's one drug that's produced by our brains, and that's that feeling of absolute absorption in the thing outside ourselves. And that's available to us at any moment in life and at any level of execution, so long as I say as we persevere with passion.
You have a way of putting into words what I guess many of us learn just by doing here. You say that the mastery of driving lies less in learning to see and steer than in learning step by step to be selectively blind,
Yes.
brutally indifferent. One form of mastery is the mastery of not seeing too much. Really an interesting observation.
Well, I think it's true. You know, when you learn to drive, one of the things you learn is that it's not that difficult on the hierarchy of things I've attempted, but it's incredibly dangerous. And we typically give it to 16-year-old kids to do because they don't accurately estimate just how dangerous it is. And one of the things you have to learn when you're driving is not to look at the danger, not to stop and think, oh my God, I've got 4 tons of steel in my hands. They're going 60 miles an hour. I turn a little bit the wrong way and it's a disaster. You have to not see that and focus on the goal. And that art of selective blindness is part of the mastery of anything. It's true of boxing as well. You have to not be overly obsessed with your opponent. You have to be aware, but not obsessed by your opponent. So selective blindness has its virtues.
Are you getting in the ring and getting hit by people?
No, I'm simply working on. I have a wonderful teacher named Joey Contrada, and we practice. But you can only learn boxing by imagining an invisible opponent. In other words, you can't learn it in isolation. You're always thinking about what the other imaginary guy is trying to do with his fists as you're trying to counter him in that way. I think it's a very powerful lesson there, that we only can think about mastery in terms of other minds, in terms of other presences. Same lesson as with the magicians. Magicians don't do magic with their fingers. They do magic with their minds. They do magic by engaging your mind and anticipating what you're thinking.
Yeah, on the technology front, it's interesting when you talk about driving that one of the biggest challenges being faced there in trying to code computers is to get them to understand what to ignore and what is significant on the road.
It's so fascinating you say that, Fred, because you were saying, as we began our conversation, that I have a very broad range. Right now, over there, I am in the middle of writing a piece about the history of parking and the future of cars. And of course, that question about the driverless car is one of the densest and richest ones. How do you teach a car not to pay attention to certain things? And how do you teach a car a computer in a car, what's absolutely vital and what's quite secondary to pay attention to? I suspect that with the new dawn of artificial intelligence, that will become better organized, but it's conceivable that we'll never get to the point where we can trust a self-driving car to drive.
Right. The general intelligence that they speak of may not be achievable, at least in our lifetimes. Who knows?
Who knows? We shouldn't be too skeptical, but it's true that it's a much higher degree of difficulty than you might think, just thinking, oh, making a self-driving car is transparent.
Well, in the end, it seems you, sir, are a master of words. This is really a wonderful book. To our audience, buy it, read it. You can't go wrong here. Adam Gopnik, thank you for spending time with us.
Fred, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.